Alright, so I've been on the hunt for a fuzz for a while, and right now I'm in the middle of a pedalboard build that I'll post in a future video. And I've really been hunting for one, maybe two fuzzes to be kind of the permanent staples on my board that are, my top tier fuzz tones across fuzz types, right? So there are fuzzes that fall into some different genres here, thinking about fuzz faces and tone benders and whatnot, and just trying to figure out, which one of these kind of really boutique, nice fuzzes hits the sound that I'm looking for. And I've tried out a lot of fuzzes before this, found ones that I like and didn't like. Shout out to like the Fulltone 69, which is a killer fuzz. But ended up, getting sold for one of these other ones that I'm gonna play, among a lot of other fuzzes, and really just on the hunt to try and figure this out. So I wanted to just film this shootout. This is not going to be any kind of editing. You're going to hear kind of the raw footage. I'm going to be playing through a Strat that has some DiMarzio area 5961, I believe, pickups. So they're the noise canceling. So the goal of this really just being to find the fuzz that sits best with me, and hopefully narrow it down to one of these. Even though I've played all of them individually and they're incredible. So figure out which one fits best for me, and hopefully this will be helpful to y'all also. So what do we learn from this test? So I noticed that the sun face where we started at least the particular model I had, I mean, it felt like the amp was gonna explode. I mean, that thing is just so massive and aggressive in a different way. Whereas the Silktone, has this really articulate, kind of in your face, high end aggression. The Sunface really just wanted to make your amp explode, and I think that has its place, but it also wasn't the most articulate. It got a little bit muddy at times, and that was kind of the opposite end of the aggression from the Silktone, which that one had a lot more top end aggression and really brought out kind of a nasal quality and high-end sizzle that, again, could be really useful in the right setting, but for kind of an all-around fuzz tone wasn't what I was looking for, but I could see it being an amazing kind of secondary fuzz tone, or depending on just what your primary fuzz is, I think it stood on its own and super well. So both really incredible fuzzes, but I don't think will be my primary. The one I was most surprised by, and I knew this a little bit going into it, just because I tried it before, was the Monsterpiece. I've had that one for a while, and even given its cost, that one really stands up to the other two, which I think were my two favorites for this test. But really, the Monsterpiece kind of stood its ground against some pretty high quality fuzzes. So I was really impressed with that one. And I think that'll be one that I keep, maybe on a mini board or even just as a backup if I'm out gigging and, need a secondary fuzz. Like, that one can hold up to anything. And then I went back and forth a lot between, the Boneyard and that Vemuram Myriad were just so impressive, and in slightly different ways. Ultimately, I think both may end up on my board, to be honest. The qualities that I loved about each of them, the Boneyard, I think it might be the best fuzz that I have ever played. I mean, if I could only choose one of them and you force me to make a decision, I think it would probably be the Boneyard. It's, despite being really aggressive, like not quite to the same degree that the Sunface is, and just like an in-your-face explosion and kind of that early attack articulation and bloom. I think it also is really articulate, and you can play major seventh chords and those notes will ring out, and the sustain is really nice. There's a ton of variety, especially with that switch on the front, as well as the extra the toggle switch on the front, as well as the extra foot switch that lets you kind of do the bypass. So even for the same knob settings, you can just get a lot of versatility out of one pedal. And it is really rich and full, and just all around super impressive. The thing that I noticed about it, though, is when I switched between the two amps, it really lost a lot of character. I mean, it took a lot of tweaking to get it to sound even somewhat good with that second amp I played it on. It was kind of amazing how it really stood up to the 2-Rock, to the TS1, and then as soon as I switched over, it kind of lost all of its richness. And that's where I think the Vemuram stood out, is in its versatility and its ability to stand up across multiple amps. So, when I switched between the two, very minor tweak to the knobs and sounded amazing, kind of no matter where I set it. I did a lot of tweaking of the bias before I recorded this, and found at multiple settings that it sounded really good. And I think it could be kind of a workhorse amp, workhorse fuzz, especially for people who are using multiple amps. just because it translated so well between the different amps that I tried. So, I think the Boneyard still stands for me as probably my favorite fuzz tone, but it's hard to argue with kind of the versatility and really the Vemuram also just kind of stands on its own. It's a slightly different quality, not quite as aggressive, a little bit closer to, in some ways, closer to a distortion, although it's still definitely a fuzz. But you can get those kind of high gain singing lead tones that on its own really really shine. So I was super impressed with both of those two, and really all five of these. I mean, my goal from this test was to try and narrow it down to just one or two, and I'm, as is always the case, convincing myself that I could see each one of these for different scenarios, bringing out that Silktone for kind of a more aggressive, articulate sound at times, especially where I'm playing stuff where guitar is kind of the main lead instrument rather than something like a vocal, and not doing kind of singing leads like you get off the Vemuram, bringing out that sun face for kind of more aggressive rhythm tones, and just kind of a really unique lead sound, and really having that Monsterpiece as kind of a do-it-all backup fuzz, or for kind of a small travel board. I mean, it's so robust, so versatile. Yeah, just really impressed with all of these fuzzes, and we'll see.